Hello again and welcome to another Warlord Wednesday, the episode of the week where we talk about all things bolt action. In today's episode, we are going to be doing another beginner's guide, this time taking a look at one of the most iconic factions from World War II. It's going to be the US Airborne. Famous in real life for their heroic actions and immortalized in the incredible miniseries Band of Brothers, the US Airborne is one of the most popular factions in bolt action. And Warlord Games clearly recognizes this because the US Airborne has one of the best and most cost-effective plastic starter armies in the game, a full 1,000 point force for about 60 quid. And they even have another starter army, some special edition mid-war paratroopers, which you can get for a little bit more. It's rare for a faction to have two starter armies. It's even rarer for a sub-faction to have two-star armies and special edition models as well. And on top of all this, the US Airborne also features in the venerable beginner set for action Band of Brothers, named after the aforementioned TV series. However, despite all this, the US Airborne are fundamentally a specialist faction. As a result, they do have a bit of a learning curve and they can be a bit tricky to operate on the battlefield, especially if you're trying to run them in a more traditional, historical way. But that's where this video comes in. I'm going to be covering some of the fundamentals of the force, their pros and their cons, and just trying to give you an idea of how they feel to play and use in the game of bolt action. To be clear, this is not the ultimate and definitive walkthrough for the Airborne. Rather, it is very much a beginner's guide. It's going to point you in the right direction and just let you know if this is the faction for you. But with all that said, let's jump on the green light and parachute right into today's episode. Now, the first thing I want to do is make something abundantly clear, especially for those people who are new to bolt action. You don't need to run a pure airborne force to have these guys in your army. It's perfectly possible and purely from a competitive point of view, maybe even advisable that you run your airborne as part of this mixed army where you've got your elite veteran airborne troopers supporting your regular infantry of American GIs and the whole thing is being backed up by a Sherman or an armored car. Despite the fact that it is based in an historical setting, bolt action is a very flexible war game and you can kind of play it however you want. If you want to have your American army to be made up of GIs, US Marines and Airborne, you can absolutely do that. There's no problem whatsoever. But for the purposes of this video, we are going to be focusing on collecting and using a pure airborne army. I just thought I'd let people know that you don't have to do it this way. But with all that covered, now let's get into the main meat of the video. And the first thing that I want to talk about, the first thing you need to be aware of is when you're running an airborne army, it's going to be made up pretty much entirely of veteran infantry. Unless you're running glider squads, every guy on your army has to be taken as a veteran. In many cases, you don't have a choice. The minimum veterancy for a paratrooper squad, for example, is veteran. You don't get to take them as regular or inexperienced. These guys are dead hard. And this even extends to your support teams. Over the course of many updates and campaign books, the Airborne have been really fleshed out by Warlord Games. And so they get access to some special versions of things like light mortar teams and medium machine gun teams. These are essentially the same as a regular medium machine gun team or regular light mortar team, except for they have to be taken as veteran to represent that they're in the Airborne. Now, there are a number of advantages and disadvantages to running a pure veteran level force. Firstly, it's going to make your guys feel incredibly tough. Against all small arms fire, anything that doesn't have a penetration value, you're only going to be killed on a 5+ army wide. That means against the majority of guns in bolt action, 66% of the time, you're just going to ignore the incoming damage as your opponent fails to hurt you. You also have army-wide the best leadership in the game. Veterans get leadership 10, whereas regulars are only leadership 9, and inexperienced are leadership 8. This makes you more durable against getting pinned out and people stacking pin markers on you. And it also means that even with 2 or 3 pins on them, your squads are still likely to do as they're told and obey orders. Unfortunately, the big disadvantage of collecting a pure veteran force is that your units tend to be very expensive. If you start taking full 10-man sticks of paratroopers and giving them all the equipment with LMGs, SMGs, anti-tank grenades and everything else, you're going to find your units getting very pricey very quickly, and you could start running out of points in your list. However, there is a little caveat to that last point, because if you're running a historical, traditional airborne army, you're going to be running a pure infantry force. This means that you will be avoiding those expensive point sinks such as tanks and armored cars. So interestingly, what you'll find is that you probably won't be outnumbered in most games. You'll have just as many infantry as your opponent does. You might even outnumber them if they've taken tanks and veteran infantry of their own. The only difference you're really going to see is you've not got any armored support. Now, being able to run a pure veteran infantry force isn't a unique thing to the Airborne. In fact, pretty much every faction in Bolt Action can do it, and they don't need to constrict themselves onto one kind of gameplay. But there is one thing that makes the Airborne a breed apart to other veteran forces, and this is their easy access to the stubborn special rule. Stubborn is a really good rule in Bolt Action, and as someone who originally poo-pooed it when I first started getting into Airborne, I have learned to love it, and it has saved my ass on more than one occasion. How it works is when you're taking a morale test, you get to ignore any and all pin modifiers. Now, to be clear, order tests are not morale tests. So what this means is if you have a unit of paratroopers and they've got 3 pins on them, and then they need to take an order test when their dice comes up to activate, you still have -3 to your leadership. You're still going to have to pass that order on a 7 or less, okay? But if you have a paratrooper squad and it gets hit by a really big high explosive weapon, maybe something like a heavy howitzer, and it ends up stacking 5 pin markers on them. If you're stubborn, what that means is when you lose half your unit in one go and you have to make that morale test, or when you're hit with a flamethrower and you have to make that morale test, you can take it at your base leadership. It doesn't matter how many pins the enemy stacked onto you. It could be 8, it could be 9. It doesn't matter. When it comes to seeing if your guys are going to break and run, you always test on that sweet, sweet leadership 10. This is huge because often in Bolt Action, units are wiped out when they break, not because they're all gunned down to a man. Typically what happens is a unit will get a few pins stacked on it from small arms fire, and then the opponent will hit them with something big, something that can wipe out half the remaining unit in one go, stack a few more pins onto them, break them, and take that dice out the bag. But with Airborne, you can't do that. More than likely, they are going to stick around till the bitter end. But then this plays into your first advantage of being all veteran. You're all really tough. So it puts your opponent in a really tricky position because they can't break you, but they're also struggling to kill you at the same time. And it's these first 2 points that should give you a really good idea for how the Airborne are going to feel on the tabletop. They are incredibly tough. They're dead hard. They're hard as nails. The Airborne is a faction that can get hit hard and will keep on coming every single time. Just a little side note here, guys. If you're looking in your Armies of the United States book and you can't see where it says stubborn on the paratrooper squad, don't worry, you've not got a defective copy. This was something that was added in later. It was part of an FAQ or a campaign book. I'm not entirely certain, but either way, your Airborne can add stubborn to each one of their squads for 1 point per man. The best place to find your up-to-date information is using an army builder such as easy army. I'll link it down in the description below. For those of you that are new to bot action, easy army is like battle scribe for bot action, except for it's 1,000 times better. Trust me, you're going to want to use it. It is like a repository of all bot action knowledge, and at the same time, it's a really, really easy way to build your lists. But getting back to the topic at hand, it's not just about being tough in the Airborne. You've also got great offensive capabilities as well. For example, your power trooper squads have plentiful access to SMGs. In fact, they can take up to 3 in a squad. This gives them really, really good close range firepower, whilst also giving those guys armed with SMGs the tough fighter special rule. This makes you very potent in close combat. In fact, each time you kill a model in close combat with a tough fighter, you get to roll an additional attack. And the cherry on top is you will find your Airborne to be a very fast and mobile force, despite the fact that they aren't bringing many vehicles to the tabletop. This is because they have access to fire and maneuver, which is the standard special rule you get for any US army. Doesn't matter if it's the army or if it's the Marines or if it's the Airborne, you get fire and maneuver. Now, what the special rule does is it means that you get to move and shoot with your rifles and BARs at no penalty. This is an incredibly powerful rule. In fact, it's probably the main draw to the US as a faction as a whole, whether you're Marines or your Army or your Airborne. Because bot action is a game of the hit modifiers, whether it's cover or it's range or it's moving and shooting, the whole game is designed around making it harder for your opponent and for you to hit each other. And of course it is. There's no armor saves. So if you hit like you did in 40k, everyone would get blown off the table inside of 2 turns. So therefore, anything that lets you get around to hit penalties, anything that allows you to hit your opponent easier than they're hitting you is really, really valuable. In fact, outside of range, probably the most common to hit modifier that you're going to encounter in bot action is moving and shooting. And the Americans, and by extension the Airborne, just don't worry about that. Combining this easy access to assault weapons with the fire and maneuver rule, and you've got an army that loves to be on the attack. It's an offensive force. You want to be dictating the flow of the battle. You want to be putting pressure on the opponent. You want to be attacking them. It's all gas, no brakes. It's speed, violence, and momentum. If you're the kind of player that likes to be dictating the flow of the battle, that likes to be putting pressure on the opponent, that just likes being the one on the attack, on the offensive, then the Airborne is definitely the faction for you. Now, so far, this all sounds pretty good, am I right? It's all coming up Airborne. But they do have a couple of big disadvantages, and this is basically part of their design. Firstly, they don't have access to a huge amount of anti-tank. Sure, pretty much every squad in your army does have access to anti-tank grenades, but AT grenades aren't very good. They're very much a last-ditch resort when it comes to dealing with enemy vehicles. Principally, you're kind of going to be relying upon a bazooka team and a medium anti-tank gun. Both of these weapons are alright. I mean, most British players are pretty jealous of the bazooka when they look at their crappy Piat, but neither one of them is going to be able to deal with anything larger than a Panzer IV. The moment a Panther or a Tiger or any late war tank turns up, you're really psychologically threatening them more than actively threatening them. My advice would be, if you encounter one of those big cats, is don't try and kill it. Try and keep it occupied. Try and scare it with your anti-tank and focus on the infantry game. And at the end of the day, this lone tank will be left on the battlefield firing its gun at you, but all of its infantry will be dead and you'll win on objectives, and you'll essentially be able to beat the Tiger or the Panther that way. However, this is a risky strategy. Leaving a deadly unit like a Tiger on the board for the course of a game could result in you taking a lot of casualties. Sure, you can go down. Sure, your opponent might only land 2 or 3 shots over the course of a 6 or 7 turn game. But each time he does manage to get that big gun to connect, it's going to tear a chunk out of your army. And even though you're a veteran, even though you only get killed on 5s, because of the +3 pen on something like a super heavy gun, you're still going to die on 2s. And every single time that it connects, it's going to combat and effective one of your units. If your opponent gets lucky and manages to hit with his big guns a few times, it doesn't matter how much you focus on the infantry game, you might not be able to pull it back. Another area where your paratroopers may struggle is on the defensive. They're very much designed to be on the attack, and your paratrooper squads reflect this. They get access to 3 SMGs, but they can only take 1 LMG. If you find yourself in an engaged, long-range, tracted firefight, the best case scenario you can hope for, let's say you're doing like an attacker-defender mission and you're trying to just hold the line, the best case scenario you can hope for is that your innate toughness and stubbornness allows you to kind of just grind it out with the opponent. And you might not win that firefight, but you're not going to lose it either. But against a really shooty army, let's say a German player turns up with all the gear, you will find yourself getting ground down pretty quickly. And you might be forced to sit in those defense positions and take it. It's not going to feel good when the Airborne are having to defend a trench rather than attack it. And one final, small, yet very important disadvantage of collecting an Airborne army is you do not really get access to the BAR. Now, the BAR is a really important piece of equipment for US armies. It's essentially a very cheap light machine gun that counts as a rifle. So you spend 20 points on an LMG and it's got like a 36-inch range and fires 4 shots. But if you move and shoot with it, it's a -1 hit penalty, of course. But if you take a BAR, it benefits from the fire and maneuver rule, which means that it only costs 5 points for one of these things, and most other American units can take 2 of them, so it's like same number of LMG shots for half the price. Sure, not as much range, but because they count as rifles, you can move and shoot with no penalty. BARs are essentially one of the hidden faction traits you get for taking Americans. It's a bit like how the Germans get STGs, it's like a hidden faction trait for them. And because Airborne can't take them, you're actually missing out on a big thing here. And they would pair so well with the Airborne as well, because you want to be able to fire and maneuver, be aggressive. They'd give you that long-range fire support. They'd be such a good pairing. But sadly, your Airborne basically don't get access to them. If you take a late war paratrooper squad from one of the campaign books, I believe it's the Battle of the Bulge one, you can take a single BAR in one of your paratrooper squads. But outside of that unique scenario, you just don't get access to them. You might be scratching your head and going, that's a bit of a weird thing. Why don't the Airborne gain access to them? Well, this is one of the things I love about Bolt Action, right? You end up learning so much about history. Apparently, when I've done my own internet research on this, as standard issue, the Airborne were never given BARs. Apparently, it was too heavy to jump with or something like that. And so that's why in the Bolt Action game, you can't take them until the late war, because they weren't issued with them. And the only reason you can take one of them here and there in late war is to kind of represent the fact that as paratrooper units got more experience and they fought through battle after battle, soldiers would naturally scrounge gear or come across gear and keep gear maybe they weren't meant to, or they'd even swap gear in some cases. And so that's why by the end of the war, even though Airborne units weren't officially issued the BAR, many squads were able to get their hands on them. And that, my little cork-around brute enthusiast, is my beginner's guide to the Airborne. I love my paratroopers. When I got into them with Bot Action, I ended up going for all the metal special edition models because I didn't care that they costed more. I just love Band of Brothers so much. And I hope that from watching this video, you've got an idea for how the faction's going to feel, and it's got you really hyped and excited for getting into Bot Action and trying out the Screaming Eagles. But of course, all of this is just like my opinion, and of course it's not a comprehensive guide. So if there's anything that I've said today that you disagree with, or any extra information that you think prospective Drum Troopers should know, get it down in that comment section below. And if you've enjoyed today's video, make sure you smash that like button and subscribe to never miss an episode. If you want to support the channel and also unlock a whole bunch of perks and see more Bolt Action content, then please consider becoming a channel member or Patreon. And I'd just like to take a moment to say a big thank you to all of the latest channel members. So a huge thank you to Major Problems, Redbear27, Axion, Kevin Goodrich, Templar, Carl Brand, Andrew Johnson, Cop180, and Branagh Lair. Thank you guys for doing your part. I also want to give a shout out to the latest Patreons as well, so a big thank you to Bad Bet, Percy McDonald, Kevin Goodrich, Proxy Nevada, Jonah Payne, Christian Bashoff, OCDM, and Zar. Thank you guys for being Patreon supporters. And last but certainly not least, I would like to say a personal, heartfelt, and a special thank you to all of my top tier Patreon supporters. These are the War Masters, the people who have truly gone above and beyond the call of duty. So I want to say a huge thank you to Alan Blunt III, Bon Bon Vert, Mark Panconi, Ross Miller, Swordfish Trombone, John Stubbs, Diesel Fox, August Varney, and Absolute Rubbish. Thank you guys. Your ongoing and incredibly generous support makes a huge difference. I hope you all enjoyed today's video. Thank you for watching, and of course, as always, I'll see you guys next time.